We just come out of a 15-minute round table discussion. We're going to go into our Q&A. We will have a much longer opportunity tomorrow morning to talk about any issues arising from your round table discussion that just took place. But in the meantime, if we have any burning questions, we've got 15 minutes now to pose some questions before we talk with the four local Lord Mayors. We've got 15 minutes to pose questions to both Philip and Laura, excuse me. So if we have any questions from the floor or even from online, we can take them. Yeah, so we'll take it from table 12. So if you could, each of you stand up and just introduce yourself to the group and online and pose the question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lynn Parker. We were curious to know a bit more about what the relationship is between the CEO and the Lord Mayor, or potentially the directly elected Mayor, in terms of accountability. Where does the buck stop, in fact, and who is answerable to whom?
I suppose a lot of that will depend on whatever model that the Assembly recommends after your deliberations. So I don't want to preempt that. There are a number of different models. An executive mayor would, in effect, take a lot of the power away from the chief executive and take a lot of those roles. You are going to hear, I think, tomorrow about the options. So, you'll be discussing that in a bit more detail. In Ireland at present, there is a proposal in Limerick for a directly elected mayor with executive powers. So in Limerick, what they're proposing is that the current chief executive will become a director general, and they will be then in charge of kind of the day-to-day running of the local authority, whereas the mayor will be the one with the executive powers, that the chief executive currently have. So that's a huge consideration in terms of governance and accountability, what the relationship between those two people will be. And as I mentioned in my presentation then as well, you will still have your full council, who are your directly elected, democratically elected representatives. So there's a kind of a three-way relationship there between the main stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Just to add to that, so for example, in law, the elected members have what's known as reserved functions. And just to give you an example of that, so for example, in relation to the 6-year development plan, that's reserved to the elected members to adopt that plan. And everything that's not a reserved function in law is an executive function. It's carried out by the chief executive and the staff. So for example, if you look at planning, the elected councillors will adopt a development plan, and then dealing with planning applications, planning decisions, planning conditions, planning refusals, planning appeals, unauthorised development is left to the executive. So what Laura is saying, and it's the same, so there's 113 currently reserved functions to councillors. And if you ever want to know what they are, you can Google this. It's on Schedule 3 of the 2014 Local Government Reform Act. That sets out all the reserved functions. So anything that's not a reserved function is an executive function. So for example, an executive, directly elected executive mayor, like in Limerick, they're proposing that some executive functions would be taken away from the chief executive and stroke or the staff and given to the mayor, so directly elected mayor. So that's what, when we talk about executive versus reserve, that's going to be crucial, I think, whatever option that's going to be taken going forward.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Lynn, for the question. It's a really important point regarding our deliberations on those executive and reserve functions and how they all sit. We're going to go to table, it'll be 1, 5, 10, 9, and then 2. So table 1, please. If you could stand up, introduce your name and pose your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Peter from Donamead. We heard at the last meeting there was a policy dispute in London in the 80s between Margaret Thatcher and Ken Livingstone, which resulted in the dissolution of the Greater London Council, and basically central government intervened to overrule a directly elected mayor. Is there scope for a similar sort of thing to happen here? How could we adequately safeguard the role from central government intervention? Would it have to be a constitutional amendment? And if so, how could that be done, basically? Thanks.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think, as you heard last weekend, the role of local government is recognised in the Constitution at present, but it's not protected. So central government can, as we've seen, abolish 80 town councils, effectively with the stroke of a pen. So yes, I suppose that's something to consider. Would it need to be a constitution? If you wanted to go that far to protect any structures, I would say that that's possibly a bigger piece for local government as a whole across the country rather than just in Dublin. But possibly something that you would want to think about. You mentioned as well just can central government impact, and that would be something that maybe you want to think about in terms of the legislation around the role of directly elected mayor, the accountability relationships, can they change the roles and so on.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's a very centrally controlled system, 1,000,000%. I just touched on it there in my presentation. So, for example, you have 31 chief executives. They report to the Secretary General of the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. And that says a lot. So they're not accounting officers, number one. In relation to central government, they've taken, if you look at the reforms in local government over the last 20-odd years, there's a lot being taken away from local authorities. And local authority model now, compared to 20-odd years ago, is a fundamentally different model. So you have a huge amount of contracting out, so for example, waste collection and many other areas. You have also local government having a more enforcement role, a regulatory role and a licensing role. So yeah, whatever you come up with, there is this fundamental stronghold that central government have in terms of numbers, in terms of funding, etc. How you could change that, I don't know, because and it seems to be becoming more centralised compared to European models. So, for example, in European models, and we signed up to a charter called the European Charter of Local Self-Government in the 90s, which enabled us then to protect local authorities with Article 28A inserted into Bunrock na HÉireann in 1999. Which means, they can change local government, they can't abolish it, without a referendum. But in relation to the role of central government, certainly it's gone in the direction of more control in all the areas. So a lot is after changing, How you'll do a U-turn on that, I don't know. I mentioned the abolition of 80 town councils, joining of other local authorities. There's been reports to even make less local authorities. So, for example, two reports in particular, the McCarthy report called On Board Snip Newer report and the McLaughlin report On Board Snip Bella report recommended 22 local authorities for Ireland. That is, for example, joining the two Corks, the two Galways and other local authorities. So it is a significant issue, the control that centre has, and a phenomenal role. And even the pay of the chief executives is less than the Secretary General. So the Secretary General is the accounting officer that is liable to be called in front of the Public Accounts Committee, not the chief executive. And just again, I don't know whether you're aware of this, there's 5 different categories of chief executives. So in other words, the chief executive of Dublin City is paid the most. Then you have the other Dublins and Cork County and Cork City, level 2. Level 3, then you have a whole load of them like Galway County, Kildare, etc. Right down to level 5, and that's your Leitrim, Longford, Roscommon, Carlow, Offaly chief executive. So there is that as well. So that structure is there in relation to that, yeah. Okay.
Thanks for the question, Peter, and the response, Philip. Very rich information there that we can all deliberate upon. Just if we've got 5 minutes left, 4 questions. If maybe Laura or Philip can just choose who will answer the question. And for those who have further questions, again, we can more discussion tomorrow. And for questions that are not answered in this session, we'll obviously take them away. So on to table 5, please.
Hi, my name's Nicole. We're just wondering if there's been previous recommendations to extend the terms of the Dublin Mayor or the Mayor in general. Why hasn't this, I suppose, been taken on board or put into being a longer term?
Yeah, there has been quite a few previous recommendations dating back to the 1990s, Barrington Report and so on. That's I can't really answer why they haven't been implemented to date. But I think, as Philip has mentioned, you might look at the central control over local government, who actually has to implement this, and that would be central government and national legislation. There has been votes before on directly elected mayors in Dublin, and that hasn't been implemented. I think at the time, what year was that, Philip? 2000.
So first of all, the idea of a directly elected mayor is around a long time. It was in a piece of legislation called the 2001 Local Government Reform Act. And they pushed again for it in another piece of legislation that I mentioned earlier on, the 2014 Local Government Reform Act. And there was a provision in that, for example, that, and here's the words that were used, a colloquium of elected members would be gathered together to discuss this. And basically what that meant was 22 elected members. And the 22 elected members were from the 4 Dublin's authorities and the Dublin Regional Authority. The regional authorities have been disbanded after the 2014 Act, and now we have 3 regional assemblies. And what they were given the remit to do was to look at different mayoral, directly elected mayor models. So I worked with that group at the time. We looked at the Boris Johnson model at the time in London, Mayor Giuliani in New York, and other models across Europe as well. And what it said then back in the legislation then, that the 4 Dublin authorities would have to agree unanimously for this, and then it would be looked at before the 2019 local elections. But Fingal voted against it. So they didn't go ahead with that. But it's around a long, long time, for definite, So, and now it's up again, and it's taken much more seriously here. As we know, we have the Citizens' Assembly to look at that. We didn't have that before, which I think is a great idea. But we have a model for Limerick, for example. A report is done by an implementation group, and a speaker from that group is going to be on today, and that's with the government. So, they've been pushing for this, and it will, as Laura said, it's ultimately a decision for central government at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Again, really great answers. Thank you very much. Now we got we're just time's compressing for us, so we're going to take question 10, 9, and 2 at the same time. So Laura and Philip, you just might write them down. So 10, 9, and 2. 10 first, please. If you could introduce yourself and the question. Then we move to 9 and 2.
Hi, this is Madeleine Johansson here. My question was just in relation to if we were to, I'm not saying that we will, but if we were to make a recommendation to amalgamate the 4 local authorities, what structural implications do you think such a move would have? Thanks.
Thanks, Madeleine. On to table number 9.
Hi, I'm Luke. Laura, you mentioned in the roles of the current Lord Mayor and mayors that exist, one of them was meetings with potential investors. Could you speak more to that and what that looks like, given that the role at the moment is purely ceremonial or diplomatic? How does that work, liaising with the people who can actually make real moves with those discussions with investors? Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. And then number 2, please. Table 2.
Hi, Rachel Batten here. I'm just wondering, is it within the scope of the Assembly to make recommendations in relation to the posts of the CEO? I suppose one of the concerns I have is what you mentioned there, the chief executives at the moment would outrank both the monetary and resource values of the proposed directly elected mayor.
Okay, so we're going to give a combination of 3 minutes now for Philip and Laura to answer those. Any overrun we can pick up in tomorrow's session. So over to you, Laura and Philip.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for those questions. I'm going to take the last 2 questions, and Philip will answer the first one. So the post of CEO, well, yes, because you're making recommendations on the structures of local government in Dublin as a whole. So in my view, that would be a key part of that. In terms of the meetings with potential investors, you could maybe ask the mayors about that themselves and their experience and you know, what kind of role they have. It is, I suppose, one of the representational roles rather than a role that has any power. The mayors generally, I suppose, meet alongside the executive of the council, the chief executives and so on, in partnership with the likes of Enterprise Ireland or IDA Ireland, who would be trying to convince companies to maybe come and invest in a certain area. So, you know, it's more so about kind of selling the county or selling the city, a more ceremonial role at present for sure. But then also, I suppose, as a whole, the elected members will have a role with the county development plan and different kind of economic development strategies that will impact on whether investors, commercial rates, that kind of thing. So there's a larger role there in general, but the one of mayor at the moment would be largely kind of representative.
Okay, and the question about the 4 Dublin authorities and kind of amalgamation there, just in relation to that, they've only recently, when I say recently, been formed. They were only formed in 1994. Prior to 1994, you had Dublin Corporation, as it was known, and Dublin County Council. And they were both changed after 1994 to Dublin City Council, and then we had South Dublin County Council, Dunleary, Rathdown and Fingal coming out of Dublin County Council. So you'd be going back in history if you did that. And the reason that they did it was the population growth of Dublin, the specific role that Dublin had, as the capital within the country, the need to have these more local authorities to deal with more specific issues around transportation, roads, etc. So it'd be a major change if it was to go back to the model it was before, you know. It'd have huge structural implications. I couldn't see that happening. What I would see happen, and the population has grown in Dublin, according to the CSO figures, and probably will grow over the next number of years. But there would be a logic of amalgamating other structures, you know, where populations are quite small, you know. So if you take the idea of Longford or Leitrim, like the population in Longford is about 29,000, and similarly in Leitrim, is it right to have a full-blown local authority there with a chief executive, directors of services, elected members and so on? So in relation to amalgamating the 4 Dublins, it's a highly unlikely thing to happen. It was there before, and they broke them down into 4 in order to deal with population and to have more specific focuses on transportation, roads and so on. Okay.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks, Laura. Really, really rich conversation. Thank you so much for your contribution there. We're going to break now. We're back at our next break for coffee. We'll say goodbye to everybody online. Back here at 11:15.